So, here's something worth sitting with as you settle in tonight. At some point in your life, you have been alone in a house at night, and you have heard a sound, not a loud sound. That's the important part. Not a crash, not a shout, nothing dramatic. Just a small noise coming from a room you were fairly sure was empty. A creak in a floorboard, a click from somewhere down the hall. The particular kind of sound a house makes constantly, all day long, that you never notice even once, until the lights are off and the world has gone quiet, and suddenly you do. And what I'd like you to remember about that moment isn't the fear itself. It's the order that things happened in, because your body was already moving. Before you had a thought, before you had a word for what you'd heard. Somewhere in the space before the sentence, "What was that?" had finished forming, your breathing had stopped, your head had turned, your muscles had tightened along your back and shoulders, and your heart had started going hard enough that you could feel it in your throat. You didn't decide to do any of that. That's worth saying again slowly, because it's the strangest fact about the whole business, and we skate right over it. You did not decide. Nobody consulted you. By the time you arrived at the scene, by the time there was a you there at all, thinking, evaluating, deciding whether this was serious, the work had already been done. Your pupils were open. Your hearing had sharpened. Blood had already been redirected out of your hands and stomach and sent somewhere it might be more useful. A set of decisions had been made on your behalf by something that did not wait for permission and did not ask what you thought. And then, a moment later, you worked out it was the heating pipes, or the cat, or nothing at all. And you lay there, feeling faintly ridiculous, while your heart came slowly back down. That thing, the fast one, the one that got there before you did, is what this is about tonight. We called it fear. But that word is doing a lot of quiet work, because fear is at least two different things wearing the same coat, and we'll get to that, and it will take a while, and it's genuinely one of the most interesting arguments in modern science. But start here. Start with the simple, physical fact that there is a system inside you running right now that is faster than your thoughts and older than your species, and it has been on continuous duty since the day you were born. It is, without much competition, the oldest thing in your mind, older than language, older than reasoning, older than imagination, older than any of the equipment you'd normally think of as you. Every single one of your ancestors, an unbroken line running back hundreds of millions of years, through people, through primates, through small nervous mammals in the dark, through things with no faces at all. Every one of them was good enough at being afraid to survive long enough to reproduce. Not one link in that chain failed. The end point of that chain is currently lying in a bed, listening to this, with a duvet on. Now here's where I want to complicate things a little. We tend to talk about fear as though it's a problem, something to be managed, something to overcome or medicate or push through. We use fearless as a compliment. We tell people not to be afraid, as if being afraid were a small personal failure, a lapse in composure. And that framing is almost exactly backwards. The science doesn't support it, and hasn't for a long time. Fear isn't a bug in an otherwise sensible mind. It's arguably the thing the mind was built around. Everything else, the planning, the reasoning, the language, the sense of humor, arrived much later, and arrived into a house that fear had already been living in for a very long time. Which raises 3 questions, and these are the ones we're going to spend tonight walking through, slowly, in order. The first is simply, what is it made of? Is there a physical thing, a piece of tissue you could point to and say that's the part? The answer turns out to be yes, and then almost immediately, in a way that's genuinely delightful. No, the second is, why are we afraid of the wrong things? Because we are, spectacularly. Almost nobody is frightened of the thing statistically most likely to kill them. Enormous numbers of people are frightened of things that will essentially never harm anyone. That isn't random. There's a reason, and it's a good one. And the third is the one that matters most. If fear is this useful, if it's this old, this refined, this carefully engineered, then why does it ruin so many lives? Why does a system built to protect people end up, in millions of cases, being the main thing standing between them and an ordinary day? I should be honest with you about something before we go any further. This is a field where the disagreements are real and the arguments are ongoing. There are researchers who have spent 40 years on this and would still describe the central question as open. If you were hoping I'd hand you a tidy answer at the end, I'm going to disappoint you slightly. But here's the thing, and this is what makes it worth 2 hours of your evening. We know an enormous amount, far more than we did even 30 years ago. We can point to the circuit, we can trace the signal from an ear to a muscle, and tell you how many milliseconds it took. We can switch the whole thing on in a laboratory animal and off again. We can find, in a hospital, a person who has lost the capacity for it entirely and describe precisely what that's like. And this is the part that would have sounded like fiction 50 years ago. We can now, in certain narrow circumstances, reach into a memory of being afraid and turn its volume down chemically. So the picture isn't finished. But it's a remarkable picture. Let me give you one image before we start properly, because we'll come back to it several times tonight, and I'd like it sitting somewhere at the back of your mind. Think about a smoke detector, the one on your ceiling, probably in the hallway. And think about what it's actually like to live with one. It has never once, in your entire life, detected a fire. What it has done is scream at you for burning toast. It has gone off because of steam from a shower. It has gone off at 3 in the morning for no reason you could ever determine, and you stood on a chair in the dark hitting it. By any normal standard, that's a badly performing object. Except it isn't, and you know it isn't, because the maths is not symmetrical. A false alarm costs you a minute of irritation. A missed alarm costs you everything you have. And when the two errors have costs that different, the correct setting isn't the accurate one. The correct setting is the jumpy one. You want a detector that would rather be wrong 100 times than late once. Hold on to that. Because that single piece of arithmetic, cheap false alarms, catastrophic misses, is not a metaphor for how fear works. It's the actual design principle. It's why the system is shaped the way it is, why it does the things it does, and why it will occasionally ruin your afternoon over absolutely nothing and be, technically, correct to do so. Right. We're going to go through all of this slowly. There's no rush at all, and nothing here needs remembering. If you drift off somewhere in the middle, and I take that as a compliment, nothing is lost. The story will still be here. You can pick up the thread wherever you land. So let's start at the beginning. And to find the beginning, we have to go back much further than you'd probably expect. Further back than psychology, further back than medicine, further back, in fact, than human beings. But the first person to look at it properly in the modern sense did something that on paper sounds faintly absurd. He went to the zoo, and he tried to win a staring contest with a snake. The man was Charles Darwin, and the year was somewhere in the middle of the 1800s, and the place was the Reptile House at London Zoo. Now, Darwin at this point in his life was interested in almost everything, but he had become particularly interested in emotion, not in a poetic way, in a mechanical one. He wanted to know what emotional expressions were for, why a frightened face looks the way it does, why the same expression appears on a person in London and a person in Tierra del Fuego, and, when you look closely, on a dog. And he had a suspicion, which was that these things weren't learned, that they were inherited, that the face you make when you're startled is not a piece of local etiquette, but a piece of anatomy, as much a part of the body's equipment as a kneecap. So he ran a small experiment on himself, which is a very Victorian thing to do. He went and stood in front of the puff adder enclosure. Now, a puff adder is a genuinely dangerous animal, and this one was behind a sheet of thick plate glass. Darwin put his face right up against that glass, close, deliberately close, and he made himself a promise. He was going to hold absolutely still. Whatever the snake did, he would not flinch. He knew the glass was there. He had checked it. He had thought it through in advance and made a firm, considered, rational decision. And the snake struck at his face, and he jumped backwards, not slightly. He wrote later that he sprang back a yard or two with what he called astonishing rapidity. and that his will and his reason were entirely powerless against something he described as an imagination of a danger he had never even experienced. That's the sentence worth keeping. His will and his reason were powerless. He knew. He had decided in advance. He was, by any measure, one of the more careful thinkers of the 19th century. And he was standing there specifically to not flinch. And none of that made the slightest difference. Because whatever it was that jumped, it had never been informed about the glass. It didn't know what glass was. It had no capacity to be told. Darwin wrote all of this up, along with a great deal else, in a book published in 1872 called The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. And it was, at the time, quite unwelcome, because the argument it made was that our emotional lives are continuous with the animal world, not similar to, continuous with, that the terror on a human face and the terror on a chimpanzee's face are not analogies for each other. They're the same object, inherited from the same place. That idea has aged extremely well. Now let's widen out from the reptile house, because Darwin was looking at one link in a very long chain. The response to threat is one of the oldest behaviors there is. Not one of the older ones, one of the oldest, full stop. Long before anything had a brain worth the name, living things were already pulling away from harm. A sea anemone retracts when touched. A worm reverses out of a bad chemical gradient. A single-celled organism will swim away from something that damages it. None of that involves feeling. None of it involves anything you could call fear. But the logic, detect, withdraw, survive, is already fully present, and it's present in things with no nervous system at all. Everything that came afterwards is an elaboration on that. Faster detection, better discrimination, more options. But the fundamental problem never changed, and it's worth stating plainly, because it explains the whole shape of what follows. And I think it's worth pausing on the sheer scale of that inheritance for a moment. Because it's easy to say hundreds of millions of years and let the number slide past without it landing. Try it this way instead. The oldest cave paintings we have are somewhere around 40,000 years old. Written language is about 5,000. Agriculture, 12. Everything you'd think of as human history. Every city, every empire, every book fits comfortably inside the last 10 or 12,000 years, which on this time scale is not even a rounding error. The threat detection system in your head is older than all of it by a factor of tens of thousands. It was already ancient when the first fish came out of the water. It was already working, more or less as it works now before flowers existed. It predates trees, so when we get to the part later tonight where this system starts behaving in ways that seem obviously unsuited to modern life, hold that in mind. It isn't that it hasn't adapted yet. It's that the entire span of modern life is far too short for it to have noticed anything had changed. The problem is this: the world contains things that will end you. And with most of them, you get exactly one chance to be wrong. That's the constraint. That's the whole design brief. Evolution is not a designer, obviously. It doesn't intend anything. But it produces designs. And it produces them by killing off everything that doesn't work. And when the penalty for one kind of mistake is death, and the penalty for the other kind is a wasted afternoon, you get a very particular sort of solution. You get our smoke detector. Look at what that asymmetry does to the numbers. Imagine an animal that reacts to a rustle in the grass. 999 times out of 1,000, it's the wind. And the animal has wasted a small amount of energy and looked slightly foolish in front of the other animals. One time in 1,000, it isn't the wind. Now imagine its more relaxed cousin, who has correctly worked out that it's almost always the wind, and who saves all that energy, and who is right 999 times running. The relaxed cousin is not your ancestor. The jumpy one is, every time, in every lineage, for hundreds of millions of years. Which means that when you flinch at nothing in a quiet house, you are not experiencing a malfunction. You are experiencing the accumulated verdict of an unimaginably long process that consistently, ruthlessly, in every generation, favored the animal that overreacted. And one more thing before we move on, because it matters for where this is going. We talk about fear as if it were a single response. It isn't. It's a toolkit. Different threats get different treatment. A threat at 50 meters and a threat at 50 centimeters are entirely different engineering problems, and the system knows the difference, and it selects accordingly, and it does all of that in less time than it takes you to become aware that anything is happening. That toolkit has more tools in it than most people realize, considerably more. And the most important one, the one that comes first, before anything else, is the one that almost nobody thinks of as fear at all. But we can't get to that yet, because Darwin couldn't get to it either. That's the frustrating thing about him, standing there in the reptile house with his heart going. He could see the flinch perfectly. He could describe it, measure it, compare it across species, and draw exactly the right conclusion from it. He just couldn't see inside. The machinery was sealed. He was a man describing the sound an engine makes without any way of opening the bonnet. For that, science had to wait another 50 years. And when the bonnet finally came up, the first thing anyone found was not a feeling, or a thought, or anything resembling a mind. It was a storm. A very fast, very well organized, entirely physical storm. And it turns out to be running through your body every single time, whether you notice it or not. The man who first mapped that storm properly was an American physiologist called Walter Cannon. Working at Harvard in the early part of the 20th century, Cannon gave us a phrase you already know: He's the reason anybody says fight or flight. And we'll come back to that phrase later. Because it's one of the most successful and most misleading pieces of science communication of the last 100 years. It's not wrong, exactly, but it's missing rather a lot. What Cannon worked out was that the body doesn't respond to an emergency with a scattering of separate reactions. It has a configuration, a single, coordinated, whole-body setting that it can switch into all at once, and it does so through a network called the sympathetic nervous system, which threads through your entire torso like wiring behind a wall. One switch, dozens of simultaneous changes. And what I'd like to do is walk through them slowly, because almost everything on this list is something you've felt, and almost nobody has ever explained to you what it was for. So, a threat is detected. The order goes out. Here is what happens next. In roughly the order it happens. Adrenaline is released from your adrenal glands, which sit on top of your kidneys, and it enters the bloodstream within seconds. Your heart rate rises, and each beat pushes more blood than it did a moment ago. Blood pressure climbs. Then the redistribution begins, and this is the part that produces most of the sensations you'd recognize. Blood is pulled away from the places that don't matter in an emergency and sent to the places that do. Your skin loses some of its supply, which is why frightened people go pale, and why your hands go cold, and why the cold arrives so fast it feels like weather. Your digestive system is effectively switched off mid-task because digestion is a luxury. And this is not the moment. That's the sudden hollow feeling in the stomach. That's why you can be genuinely hungry 1 second and completely unable to eat the next. Where does all that blood go? Into the large muscles. Thighs, arms, back. The parts you'd use to run or to fight. Your airways widen to move more air. Your breathing gets faster and shallower and moves up into the chest. Your pupils dilate, which lets in more light and widens your field of view at the cost of fine focus. You become better at noticing movement and worse at reading. Your liver dumps stored glucose into your blood. Fuel delivered on demand, no waiting. You sweat, particularly on your palms and the soles of your feet, which seems like poor design until you learn that slightly damp skin grips better than dry skin. That's not an accident, and it's not modern. That's a primate adaptation for holding on to branches, still running, in a species that mostly holds onto steering wheels. Your hair stands up every single time. On your arms, on the back of your neck, the sensation people describe as a chill going down the spine. On an animal with a proper coat, that's genuinely useful. It makes you look bigger, and size matters in a confrontation. On a modern human, it accomplishes precisely nothing. It's a gesture from an ancestor, still faithfully performed tens of thousands of years after the fur went. And then there are the changes to perception, which are the strangest ones. Pain sensitivity drops, sometimes dramatically. People finish a fight or a car crash and only later discover they're injured. Peripheral vision narrows down, and time, subjectively, stretches out so that a 2-second event can be recalled in far more detail than 2 seconds should contain. Now look at that list as a whole. Every single item on it is a preparation for violent physical exertion. It is, from beginning to end, a body getting ready to sprint or to fight something. There isn't one item on that list that helps you think or negotiate or wait or be patient. Keep that in mind, because we'll be coming back to it in about an hour, and by then it will have become a rather serious problem. There's a second wave too, and it's slower. Alongside the fast adrenaline system, there's a slower one built from a chain of glands. The hypothalamus signals the pituitary. The pituitary signals the adrenal glands, and the adrenal glands release cortisol. Researchers call it the HPA axis. It takes minutes rather than seconds, and it isn't built for a sprint. It's built for a siege, for a threat that lasts hours or days, where the body needs to keep glucose available, keep inflammation suppressed, and keep going. It's an elegant system. It's saved an enormous number of lives, and it is going to cause us a very great deal of trouble later on tonight. Make a small note of it. We'll come back. Now, the thing to appreciate about all of this is the cost. That entire response is metabolically expensive. It burns fuel, it suppresses maintenance, it puts strain on the heart and the vessels, and run often enough or long enough, it does measurable damage. This is not a cheap system to operate, and evolution is not sentimental about waste. So the fact that it exists at all, the fact that it wasn't optimized away, that it was kept, refined, and made faster over hundreds of millions of years, tells you something quite stark about the alternative. Whatever this costs, being slow cost more. But there's something missing from Cannon's list. Something that everybody misses, because the phrase he gave us is so memorable that it crowded out the truth: fight or flight. 2 options. It's neat, it's alliterative, it's on every poster, in every doctor's waiting room in the world, and it's incomplete. Because the first thing your body actually does when it detects a threat isn't fight, and it isn't flight. It's neither. It's the exact opposite of both. You stop before anything else, before the running, before the fighting, before any of the machinery from the last section gets used for anything. You freeze. It lasts somewhere between a few hundred milliseconds and several seconds. Your muscles tense but don't move. Your breathing halts. Your head may turn very slightly, orienting toward the source. And here's the detail that gives the whole thing away. In a true freeze, your heart rate often goes down, not up. It's called fear bradycardia, and it's been measured in a great many species, including ours, which is genuinely counterintuitive. And it tells you this isn't just a pause before the real response. It's a response in its own right, with its own physiology. Why would stopping be the default? Two reasons, and they're both excellent. The first is that movement is what gets you seen. A very large number of predatory visual systems are built primarily to detect motion, not shape. Stillness is close to invisibility, and it's free. It costs nothing to stop. The second is that you have almost no information yet. Something happened. You don't know what. Running is a commitment. You might run toward the thing. Fighting is a bigger commitment still. Freezing buys you a few hundred milliseconds of information gathering at essentially zero cost. And in a system built on cheap errors, that's an extremely good trade. So the fuller picture, the one researchers actually work with now, isn't a choice between two options. It's a sequence, and what determines your position in it is mainly distance and how many options you have left. It goes like this. First, freeze. Threat detected, not identified, not close. Stop, orient, gather. Then, if the threat is confirmed and there's a way out, flight. Escape is always the preferred option where it's available, because fighting is dangerous even when you win. If escape is cut off, fight. Not because it's a good plan, but because it's the only one left. And then there's the fourth stage, which most people have never heard of, and which is the reason this sequence matters far beyond a biology lesson. If the fight has failed, and you've been caught, and struggling has stopped working, the body has one more setting, and it's called tonic immobility, sometimes just fright. The muscles lock. Movement becomes impossible, not difficult, impossible. Pain perception drops sharply. Many people describe a sense of floating away, of watching from outside, of the whole thing happening to someone else. It's been documented across an enormous range of species. It's the thing an animal does when a predator has it in its jaws. There's a theory that it works because many predators lose interest in prey that stopped moving, or release it to reposition. And in that window, there's sometimes a chance. It happens in humans, and it happens most often during physical or sexual assault. And I want to be careful and clear here, and then move on, because it matters more than almost anything else in this section. Tonic immobility is involuntary. It is a brainstem response. It is not a decision. It is not consent, and it is not something a person could have chosen to override, any more than Darwin could have chosen not to jump. Enormous numbers of survivors have been told otherwise, sometimes by other people, more often by themselves. And it isn't true. There's a fifth stage as well, and it's the strangest. Fainting. For most threats, blood pressure goes up. But for one particular category, the sight of blood, of injury, of needles, a subset of people show the opposite. Blood pressure and heart rate drop sharply, and they lose consciousness. It's the only kind of phobia that reliably makes people faint. Why it exists is still debated. One suggestion is that dropping your blood pressure, while badly wounded reduces blood loss. Another is that going limp is a last resort signal to a predator that you're already dead. Nobody's certain. Now, all of this probably feels quite far from your evening. So let me bring it right back into this room, because there is one place where nearly everyone meets the freeze response directly, and it happens in a bed every night when you enter REM sleep, the stage where most vivid dreaming happens. Your brainstem does something remarkable. It paralyzes you. Almost every voluntary muscle in your body is switched off deliberately and held off. Your eyes still move. Your breathing continues. Everything else is disconnected. This is an excellent piece of engineering. Without it, you would physically act out your dreams, which is a real and rather dangerous condition when the mechanism fails. But occasionally the timing slips. Occasionally, awareness comes back before the paralysis lifts. And so you wake up, genuinely awake, eyes open, aware of the room, aware of the time, inside a body that will not move at all. And here is what makes it so much worse than it sounds. You now have a threat detection system that has just come online in the dark and has discovered that the body is completely immobilized and has no way whatsoever to check whether that's dangerous. It cannot test the situation because it cannot move. So it does what it always does with insufficient information and enormous stakes. It escalates. That's why sleep paralysis so reliably comes with the same content. A presence in the room, something in the corner, weight on the chest, the absolute certainty that somebody is standing just out of sight. And the extraordinary thing is how consistent this is across the whole of humanity. Different centuries, different continents, no contact between them, and the same experience keeps being reported with the same core features and different local costumes. A witch, a demon, a visitor, an old woman sitting on the chest. In one culture it's a spirit, in another it's an alien, and in every case it's the same brainstem doing the same thing at the same point in the night, which means that a fairly large slice of the world's supernatural folklore is, in all likelihood, a description of this precise moment, the same moment, just told by people who had no reason to think it was anything other than what it seemed. And I'll mention gently that your body is beginning that exact process right now, on schedule, as it does every night, quite safely, starting to let go of the muscles, one system at a time, in the correct order. Nothing about it needs your attention. It has done this every night of your life. So, a system that measures distance, counts your options, selects between 5 distinct responses, and gets it approximately right in under a second, in the dark, without consulting you. That is not a reflex. A reflex is a knee jerking. This is something making decisions, which means there has to be a structure. Something physical sitting somewhere in the head doing the calculating. and in the 1930s, two researchers found it completely by accident, while looking for something else entirely. Their names were Heinrich Klüver and Paul Bucy, and what they were actually investigating was hallucination. Klüver had been studying mescaline and its effects on perception, and he wanted to know which part of the brain was involved. So, working with the neurosurgeon Bucy, he began removing portions of the temporal lobes in rhesus monkeys to see what changed. What changed was not what they were looking for. The monkeys came out of surgery different animals. Rhesus macaques are, ordinarily, difficult and wary, and perfectly capable of aggression. They are not animals you handle casually. After the operation, they were placid, utterly untroubled. They would allow themselves to be picked up by people who had previously been treated as threats. And more strikingly, they had stopped being frightened of anything. Objects that had reliably terrified them before, snakes in particular, could now be placed in front of them, and they would examine them calmly, pick them up, put them in their mouths, which is a rhesus monkey's way of investigating anything unfamiliar. The alarm hadn't been dulled. It appeared to have been removed. It became known as Klüver-Bucy syndrome, and it was the first time anyone had produced fearlessness surgically. The temporal lobe is a large piece of tissue, though, and it took decades of narrowing down to find the specific structure responsible. When they did, it turned out to be small. There are two of them, one in each hemisphere, buried deep in the temporal lobes, roughly the size and shape of an almond. In fact, that's exactly what the name means. Amygdala is simply the Greek word for almond, given to it by an anatomist in the early 1800s who was describing what it looked like and had no idea what it did. And its position in the wiring is everything. The amygdala receives sensory information very early, earlier than the parts of the brain that do careful analysis. It sits close to the hypothalamus and has strong connections down into the brainstem, which means it has short, direct lines to every single thing described earlier. The adrenaline, the blood redistribution, the freeze, all of it. So it isn't the alarm bell. The alarm bell is your whole body. The amygdala is the thing that decides to ring it. We know this with unusual confidence, partly for a slightly uncomfortable reason. Patients undergoing brain surgery for severe epilepsy are sometimes awake, with electrodes placed to map tissue before anything is removed. And when a current is applied to the amygdala, patients report a sudden, immediate, overwhelming sense of dread, not a memory of fear. Fear itself arriving out of nowhere, with no event attached to it and nothing in the room to explain it. Some describe it as a feeling that something terrible is about to happen. The current stops and it goes. So, found it. A physical object, a couple of centimeters across, and if you interfere with it, the whole system changes. Which brings us to a woman I'm going to call SM, because that's what the scientific literature calls her. And she is one of the most extraordinary people ever studied. SM has a condition called Urbach-Wiethe disease. It's genetic, it's very rare, and among other effects, it can cause calcium deposits to build up in soft tissue. In her case, over the course of her childhood, it destroyed both of her amygdalae, completely, bilaterally. By adulthood, there was essentially nothing left of either one. Everything else about her was intact. Normal intelligence, normal memory. She was described by the researchers who worked with her over decades as friendly, talkative, unusually open with strangers. She could not feel fear. Not was brave. Not was good at managing it. The capacity appeared to be simply absent, and a team of researchers spent years trying, with increasing creativity, to find something that would produce it. They took her to an exotic pet shop. She had said she hated snakes and spiders and would avoid them. Within moments of walking in, she was asking to hold a snake, and did. Then she was stroking it and asking questions about it, and had to be told 15 separate times not to touch the larger, genuinely dangerous ones, because she kept drifting back toward them, apparently fascinated. When the staff asked her why, she said she was overwhelmed by curiosity. They took her through a haunted house attraction, a genuinely elaborate one, in a disused sanatorium, staffed by actors trained to frighten people. She led the group. She walked ahead of everybody. When actors jumped out at her, she didn't flinch. On at least one occasion, she startled them, because she walked straight up to one of them and poked him in the head out of interest. She laughed most of the way round. They showed her every frightening film they could find. Nothing. And then there's her life outside the laboratory, which is much harder to hear about. She had been held at knife point. She had been threatened with a gun at close range in a park at night. She had been physically assaulted, and in her accounts of these events, there is no fear in them anywhere. After the incident in the park, she walked home. She went back through the same park the following day. She could tell you what fear was. She understood the concept perfectly, could recognize it in other people, could describe what it was supposed to do. She simply could not generate it. And a life without a threat detector, it turns out, is not a life of freedom. It's a life of walking repeatedly into things that other people can see coming. So there it is. Clean and about as conclusive as neuroscience gets. No amygdala, no fear. The circuit has been found, the case is closed, and we can all go to sleep except. There's a question sitting underneath all of that, and it's a small one, and it sounds like the kind of thing only a philosopher would care about. Everything we just described in SM was a behavior. She approached snakes. She didn't flinch. She led the group. She walked home. Those are things a body does, and every single one of them can be observed from the outside, measured and written down. But the thing you and I actually mean by fear isn't a behavior. It's a feeling. It's the awful cold weight of it. The thing that happened in your chest in that dark house. So which one had she lost? Had she lost the feeling? Or had she only lost the machinery that produces the behavior? And if those turned out to be two different systems, how on earth would anyone ever tell the difference from the outside? Hold that question. Don't lose it. And remember her, because we are going to come back to SM later tonight, quite a long way from here. And what happened when researchers tried one last thing with her changed everything anybody thought they knew. Now, that question, feeling against behavior, probably sounds like the sort of thing you'd argue about at the end of a long evening and then forget. It sounds like philosophy. It isn't. It turned out to be the single most consequential argument in the science of fear. And the strangest part of the story is who ended up making it. Because the man who spent 30 years assembling the most detailed map of the fear circuit anybody had ever produced, then spent the rest of his career arguing that the entire field, very much including himself, had been describing it wrongly the whole time. His name is Joseph Ledoux, and he worked mainly at New York University. And what he did in the 1980s and 90s was to take a very simple experiment and follow it patiently all the way down into the wiring. The experiment itself is almost boringly simple. You play a rat a tone. Nothing happens. The rat ignores it the way you'd ignore a distant car door. Then you play the tone and pair it with something unpleasant. You do this a small number of times. Often just once or twice is enough. And from that point on, the tone alone will produce the full response. The animal stops dead. Heart rate changes. The entire cascade fires at a sound that a moment ago meant nothing at all. That's fear conditioning, and it's the workhorse of the field. And Ledoux's question was straightforward. Where exactly does that signal travel? Sound comes in at the ear. Freezing comes out at the muscles. What's the route in between? So he traced it, piece by piece, by carefully interrupting one link at a time and seeing whether the response survived. And what he found was that there wasn't one route. There were two. The first one is the one you'd expect. Sound arrives at the ear, gets relayed through a structure called the thalamus, which is essentially the brain's switchboard, and is sent up to the auditory cortex, where it is properly analyzed. Pitch, timbre, location, identity. What is this sound? Where is it? Have I heard it before? And then, having worked all that out, the cortex passes its conclusion down to the amygdala, which decides what to do about it. That's the sensible route. Careful, accurate, thorough. But Ledoux found a second one. And the second one is what makes everything else make sense. There is a direct connection from the thalamus straight to the amygdala. It bypasses the cortex entirely. It skips the analysis. He called them the low road and the high road. The high road is the thorough one, slower, accurate, detailed. The low road is fast and extremely crude. It carries almost no detail, a smear, an impression, a shape, and a suggestion of motion. In a rat, the low road delivers its signal in around 12 milliseconds. The high road takes roughly twice that. In a human brain, with a much larger cortex to travel through, the gap is wider still. Now, 12 milliseconds versus 24 doesn't sound like a meaningful difference. It's less time than a single frame of film. You could not possibly notice it. But consider what it buys you. You're walking on a path, and there's a curved shape lying across it. The low road gets a rough impression, long, curved, in the wrong place, and does not wait for confirmation of any kind. It fires. Your body is already committed, already stopping, already pulling back, already flooding with adrenaline. Some fraction of a second later, the high road finishes its analysis and reports back. It's a garden hose, and you stand there on the path with your heart going, feeling extremely foolish, having just been thrown backwards by a piece of rubber. But notice, you were not badly served. You were served exactly as designed. The low road isn't trying to be correct. It has no ambition to be correct. Its entire job is to be early and to accept an enormous rate of false positives in exchange, because that is precisely the arithmetic we started with tonight. The 100 wrong answers cost you nothing. The one right answer is the only one that ever mattered. This is the smoke detector, drawn as an actual circuit diagram inside a skull. And for about 20 years, that was the settled picture. The amygdala is the fear center. The low road is the fast path. Fear conditioning is how fears are learned. It was clean, it was well evidenced, it went into every textbook, and Ledoux had built most of it. And then he turned around and said we'd all misunderstood what he'd found. His argument, made repeatedly and with some force from the early 2000s onward, goes roughly like this. Everything he had mapped was a defensive survival circuit. It is an automatic system that detects threat and produces responses, freezing, physiological changes, behavior. It is real, it is well understood, and it works essentially the same way in a rat, a rabbit, and a human being. But the conscious feeling of fear, the awful, cold, unmistakable experience of being afraid, is, he argued, a different thing entirely. It's assembled later, in cortical networks, out of several ingredients. The survival circuit's output, your memory, your sense of the situation, and crucially, your awareness of yourself as someone this is happening to. It requires a great deal of machinery that the survival circuit doesn't need and doesn't have. And here is the uncomfortable consequence. When a rat freezes, we say it's afraid. But what we have actually observed is a circuit executing. Whether anything accompanies that execution, whether there is any experience there at all, is a completely separate question and the experiment cannot answer it. It was never designed to. We looked at behavior, and we assumed the feeling came along with it. Because when we freeze, there's certainly a feeling, and it seemed obvious. Ledoux's position is that this was a category error, sitting quietly at the foundation of an entire field for decades. He has said more than once that he wishes he'd never used the word fear in his research papers at all, that he should have called them threat circuits and left it there. And now flip it around, because the reverse is the interesting direction. If the circuit and the feeling can be separated, if they are genuinely two different systems that usually run together, then everything neuroscience has confidently established might be a map of threat detection rather than a map of fear as you actually experience it. Two things, one word, and 100 years of careful work in which nobody could be entirely sure which of the two they were holding. Sit with the strangeness of that for a moment. It's the sort of problem that only becomes visible once someone points at it, and then becomes impossible to unsee. And it isn't merely an academic tidiness issue either. It has consequences that reach into a great many lives. Think about what it means for treatment. If the feeling of fear and the circuit that produces defensive behavior are separate systems, then a drug that quietens one may do very little to the other. And that is, in fact, roughly what clinicians have been observing for decades without quite having the language for it. There are medications that reduce the physical storm beautifully. The racing heart, the shaking hands, the tightness in the chest, and leave the person still sitting there, entirely and miserably afraid. The body has been talked down. The occupant has not. And it runs the other way as well. There are people who will tell you, quite sincerely, that they aren't frightened of anything, while their heart rate, their skin conductance, and their sleep all say something different. The circuit is running at full volume, and the conscious report has no idea. So the two things come apart in both directions in ordinary clinical life. We just kept calling them by the same name and wondering why the picture never quite resolved. Hold that thought as well, because it's going to matter enormously later tonight when we come back to the woman who could not be frightened. The question of which of the two she had lost is not a technicality. It's the whole thing. But whichever of those two things fear turns out to be, the circuit, the feeling, or some arrangement of both, neither of them arrives fully formed. Almost nothing on your personal list of frightening things was there at birth. You learned them. And the experiment that demonstrated it most famously is one that could not be run today in any country by anyone, under any circumstances at all. Let's do the mechanism first, because it's a clean, and then the story, because the story is not. You already know the shape of it from Pavlov. A neutral signal, a bell, a light, a tone, gets repeatedly paired with something that matters, and the signal takes on the meaning of the thing. Eventually, the bell alone does the work. Fear conditioning is that same process. And it has one property that sets it apart from almost every other kind of learning. It's fast. Absurdly fast. Most learning requires repetition. You don't learn a language or a skill or a route through a city from a single exposure. But a fear association can be installed in one pairing, a single event, and the link is made, and it can hold for the rest of your life. Look at what that tells you about the design priorities. The system is willing to draw a firm, permanent conclusion from a single data point, which is statistically indefensible and would be considered appalling reasoning in any other context. And it's correct to do it for the same reason as everything else tonight. You do not get to sample a predator repeatedly to establish a reliable pattern. There is no second trial. Now the story. In 1920, at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, a psychologist named John B. Watson published a paper with his graduate student, Rosalie Rayner. Watson was, at the time, one of the most prominent psychologists in America and the founder of behaviorism. The view that psychology should abandon all this unmeasurable business about inner experience and study only what can be observed. Behavior in, behavior out. He is also the source of a famous boast. Give him a dozen healthy infants and control of the environment they were raised in, and he could shape any one of them into anything you liked. Doctor, lawyer, artist, thief, regardless of talent, tendency, or ancestry. The paper he published was an attempt to demonstrate the first half of that claim. The subject was an infant, referred to in the paper as Albert B., and known ever since as Little Albert. He was around 9 months old when they began testing him, and about 11 months when the conditioning started. They began by establishing his baseline. They showed him a white laboratory rat, a rabbit, a dog, a monkey, cotton wool, burning newspaper, various masks. He was, by their own account, a remarkably placid child. He showed no fear of any of it. He reached for the rat with obvious interest. Then they established what would frighten him, and what frightened him was sudden, loud noise, as it frightens every infant, because that response is built in and requires no learning at all. They found that striking a suspended steel bar with a hammer behind his head reliably made him cry, and then they put the two together. They presented the rat, and as he reached out toward it, at the moment his hand extended, they struck the bar behind his head. They did this a small number of times, spread over a couple of sessions. Not many. 7 pairings in total. And then they presented the rat on its own, in silence, with nothing behind him. He cried immediately. He turned away. He crawled off across the table so fast that they had to catch him at the edge. 7 pairings. A child who had reached for the animal with delight now could not be in a room with it. But the finding that actually mattered scientifically was what came next. And it's the reason this experiment is still taught. The fear didn't stay put. They tested him with other things, and the fear had spread on its own, without any further conditioning, to objects he had never been harmed near. A rabbit, which produced a strong reaction, a dog, a sealskin coat, cotton wool, a Santa Claus mask with a white beard, which Watson wore himself. Nobody had taught him to fear any of those. The association had generalized outward along a dimension, white, furry, soft, and captured everything it touched on the way. That's generalization, and it is one of the most consequential facts in this whole field because it explains why fears grow. A single car accident does not leave you frightened of one junction on one afternoon. It leaves you uneasy about that road, then that kind of road, then driving in rain, then motorways, then, for some people, cars. Nobody adds those. They arrive on their own. The system is not building a precise record of a specific danger. It is drawing a wide circle around it and shading in everything nearby. Because, one more time, the cost of drawing it too wide is inconvenience, and the cost of drawing it too narrow is the thing you were trying to avoid. And then there's the rest of the story, which is the part that gives it its weight. The fear was never removed. Watson had written about deconditioning. He had ideas about how to do it. He never applied them to Albert. The child left the hospital. His mother worked there and moved on. And by the account in the paper, the researchers knew the date was coming and simply ran their final tests up to it. Watson himself left Johns Hopkins that same year, dismissed over his affair with Rayner, whom he later married. He went into advertising, joined the J. Walter Thompson Agency, and applied his principles to selling things, at which he was extremely successful. He spent the rest of his career explaining how to attach emotional responses to products. And for the better part of a century, people have tried to find out what became of Albert. There have been serious attempts. Records were combed through, hospital staff lists reconstructed, candidates proposed. One line of research identified a child who died at the age of 6 of hydrocephalus and argued he had been neurologically impaired at the time of the experiment. A later line proposed a different child altogether, who lived a long life and whose family reported he had a lifelong dislike of dogs, though they had no idea why, and nobody in the family had ever heard of the study. The honest answer is that we don't know. Both cases have supporters and problems. The most cited experiment in the history of fear research ends with a child leaving a building and the record going quiet. So that's how a fear gets installed. One pairing, and it spreads on its own, which raises an obvious question. And the answer to it is the most surprising thing in this entire subject. If fear can be installed that easily, and if it spreads outward by itself, why isn't everybody terrified of everything? You have had thousands of unpleasant experiences. Why did only a handful of them stick? Something is filtering. Something is deciding which lessons are allowed in. And when you find out what it's filtering for, it explains one of the strangest facts about modern life, that almost nobody is afraid of the thing most likely to kill them. Start with the observation, because it's genuinely odd once you look at it directly. Make a list of the things people are commonly, seriously frightened of. Snakes, spiders, heights, deep water, the dark, enclosed spaces, being watched by a crowd, blood. Now make a list of what actually kills people in a developed country. Heart disease, cancer, road traffic, falls at home, mostly on stairs, poor diet across decades, sitting down for 40 years. Those two lists have almost nothing in common. Consider how strange that is. You have been in a car at speed thousands of times. It is statistically among the most dangerous things you routinely do, and it kills over 1 million people a year worldwide. And approximately nobody has a car phobia. People fall asleep in cars. Meanwhile, a large proportion of the population is frightened of spiders. In most of the world, essentially no spider poses any threat to a human being whatsoever. There are people who cannot stay in a room with a photograph of one. That is not random noise. If fear were simply learned from experience, the lists would match, because experience is where the actual danger is. They don't match, so something else is going on. The answer is a concept called preparedness, proposed by the psychologist Martin Seligman in the early 1970s. And it's this: we are not blank slates for fear learning. Some associations are learned almost instantly and are extremely difficult to unlearn. Others are learned poorly or not at all. No matter how many times you pair them, the brain arrives pre-tilted. It has opinions before you've had a single experience about what sort of thing is worth being frightened of. And the most elegant demonstration of that came from work with monkeys, principally by Susan Mineka and Michael Cook. And it unfolds in 3 steps that I think are worth taking slowly, because the design is beautiful. Step 1. Take rhesus monkeys raised in a laboratory who have never encountered a snake in their lives. Show them one. They are not afraid. They're curious, occasionally cautious, but there's no fear response, which already tells you the fear isn't simply hardwired at birth. It has to come from somewhere. Step 2. Now let one of those lab-reared monkeys watch a wild-reared monkey, one who grew up outside and has a full-blown snake reaction, respond to a snake. The observer watches another monkey be terrified. And that's it. That's the whole exposure. The observer now has a strong, immediate, durable fear of snakes, acquired entirely second-hand from watching, with no unpleasant experience of its own whatsoever. And it persists. Months later, it's still there. That alone is a striking result, but it's Step 3 that makes it extraordinary. because Cook and Mineka then did the experiment with videotape. They filmed a monkey reacting with fear, and they edited the footage, spliced it so that the same monkey, showing the exact same terrified reaction, appeared to be reacting to something else. A brightly colored artificial flower, a toy rabbit, identical social signal, identical facial expression, identical body language, identical intensity, identical everything. Only the object changed and the monkeys watching learned nothing at all. You cannot teach a monkey to be afraid of a flower by showing it another monkey being terrified of a flower. The same footage teaches snake fear perfectly and flower fear not at all. So it isn't that we inherit fears. We inherit a bias about what fear is for. A set of slots waiting to be filled by experience, and some of those slots are wide open and take almost anything, and others are essentially sealed shut. Similar work in humans points the same way. If you condition people to fear images of snakes and spiders, and separately condition them to fear images of flowers and mushrooms, both associations form. But the snake and spider associations are markedly more resistant to extinction. They linger after the flower associations have faded. And in experiments where the images are flashed too briefly to be consciously seen, the fear-relevant ones still produce a measurable physical response. Something is registering them below the level of your awareness and treating them as a different category of thing. Which brings me to the dark, and I mention it because you're lying in it. Fear of the dark is close to universal in childhood and never fully leaves most adults. It just becomes better managed. And it's often described as irrational, as a fear of nothing, since there is by definition nothing in the dark that wasn't there with the lights on. But that misunderstands what's being feared. Humans are overwhelmingly visual animals with genuinely poor night vision compared to most of what used to hunt us. For nearly all of our history, the loss of light was not neutral. It was a real, sharp, measurable increase in risk every single night for hundreds of thousands of years. The dark isn't frightening because of what's in it. It's frightening because it takes away the sense you depend on most and leaves you with hearing, which is precisely why one small sound in a quiet house can do what it does. We started tonight in that exact moment. That's what was happening. Now here's the problem. And it's the whole problem. That calibration is thousands of generations old. It was set by a world of predators and cliffs and venom and darkness. And it was set extremely well for that world. Cars are about a century old. Electrical sockets, less. Processed sugar at scale, less. Staircases in every home, a few hundred years. Sitting at a desk for 40 years, a single generation. The system has had no time to update, and it isn't going to, because updating happens through differential survival across generations. And cars simply have not been killing us for long enough for that process to have started. So, here is where the metaphor lands properly. Your smoke detector isn't faulty. It was installed correctly and carefully for a house that had an open fire burning in the middle of the room and no chimney. It was calibrated for that house by people who knew exactly what they were doing. You have since moved. You now live somewhere with central heating, a sealed oven, and no open flame anywhere. Nobody came to recalibrate the detector. Nobody can. It is doing precisely what it was built to do, in a building it was never designed for. And I'll say, since you're lying there in the dark thinking about snakes and open flames, that the system knows perfectly well where you are. This is a room whose sounds it has learned. It has run its checks. It has nothing to report. That's why you can lie here and consider all of this quite comfortably. Now, those monkeys learned to be terrified of an animal they had never met from watching a screen. So do we, constantly, invisibly, and starting a very long time before we can speak. There's a classic experiment involving a piece of apparatus called a visual cliff. It's a sturdy table with a glass surface, arranged so that halfway across the floor appears to drop away. Solid ground on one side, an apparent drop on the other, with strong glass over the whole thing. It's completely safe and looks anything but. Put an infant of around a year old on the shallow side, with a parent on the far side, and the child crawls happily until it reaches the edge. Then it stops, and then it does something extraordinary. It looks up at the parent's face. That's it. That's the whole finding, and it's one of the most important results in developmental psychology. The child does not evaluate the drop. It has no way to evaluate the drop. What it does instead is check a face, and then it does whatever that face tells it. If the parent looks encouraging, most infants cross. If the parent looks frightened, almost none of them do. Some retreat, some become distressed. The physical situation is identical in both cases. The only variable is an expression on somebody else's face, and it determines the child's behavior completely. It's called social referencing, and it's running constantly in early childhood. A child at an ambiguous moment doesn't ask, "Is this dangerous?" It asks, "Does anyone look worried?" Now scale that up over years. A parent who is frightened of spiders does not generally sit their child down and explain that spiders are frightening. They just flinch, small, quick, involuntary. A sharp intake of breath, a step back, a change in the voice. And a child watching that a few hundred times before the age of 5 has received an education far more effective than any lecture. One delivered without a single word by someone who would have sworn they were being careful not to pass it on. This is why phobias run through families in ways that have nothing to do with genetics. The mechanism is right there in the room, and it points to something about the fear response that we haven't looked at yet. We've been treating it as a private system, aimed inward, doing a job for one body. But a good deal of it is aimed outward. Take the startled face, widened eyes, raised brows, mouth open, head back. It's remarkably consistent across cultures. And there's an argument, with evidence behind it, that it does two jobs at once. Widening the eyes measurably increases your field of view and speeds up eye movements, useful for you, immediately. But it also produces an unmistakable, high contrast, visible at distance signal that everybody who can see you can read instantly. One movement. Two functions. Protecting yourself and warning everybody else in the same gesture, and you can't do one without the other. There may be a chemical layer too, though here I want to be careful, because this is genuinely contested. There's a body of research on human chemosignals, sweat collected from people in frightening situations, and separately from the same people during exercise, and then presented to other people who have no idea which is which. The reported findings are that people exposed to fear sweat show measurable changes, heightened startle responses, faster threat detection, altered amygdala activity in scanners. And they consistently report noticing nothing whatsoever. The effects are small, the studies are difficult, and replication has been uneven. I'd file it as a real possibility rather than an established fact. But the phrase, "I could smell the fear in the room," may not be entirely a figure of speech, which is a strange thought to be handed. And then there's what happens at scale. Alarm moves through a crowd faster than any information about what caused it. In a genuine crowd panic, the overwhelming majority of people running have not seen a threat. They have seen other people running, which is functionally the same thing, because in an environment where a delay of 1 second could be fatal, a system that waits for you to independently verify the danger is a system that gets you killed. So the response is, move first, ask later. You can see the same architecture, stripped to its essentials, in a flock of starlings turning as one, or a school of fish. There is no leader. Each individual is responding to its immediate neighbors with a delay measured in milliseconds. And the result is a wave of behavior that crosses thousands of animals faster than any individual could possibly react to the original threat. Human crowds run the same algorithm with slightly worse hardware. And it's worth noticing how completely this overrides everything else about a person. Education doesn't help. Intelligence doesn't help. Knowing about the phenomenon certainly doesn't help. People who study crowd behavior for a living report moving with the crowd exactly like everybody else, and only realizing afterwards. You cannot reason your way out of it in the moment, because the moment is over long before reasoning arrives. It's the low road again, wearing a different coat, a system that has concluded correctly that in a genuine emergency, the cost of independent verification is higher than the cost of being wrong along with everyone else. The same shape, incidentally, describes how rumor and mass anxiety propagate through a population. I leave that observation there rather than pursue it, because the point I'm making is mechanical rather than political. The architecture is identical. It's the same wave. It just moves through different material. So bring it back to you, lying there. Some meaningful proportion of your personal catalogue of fears did not come from anything that ever happened to you. It was installed by watching, by faces, flinches and tones of voice, most of it before you were old enough to remember any of it. And the people you caught it from, very often, caught it the same way, from someone else, who caught it from someone else, which means it is entirely possible to carry a fear that has no original event anywhere in its history, a fear that has been passed hand to hand down a chain of frightened people, none of whom ever saw the thing. So fear is ancient, automatic, contagious, installed in a single trial and very difficult to remove, which makes the next fact almost impossible to account for. Every year, millions of people pay money, voluntarily, cheerfully in advance, often queuing in the rain, to be made to feel exactly this. Let's take that seriously, because it looks at first like it breaks everything we've said. Consider the scale of it. The horror film industry. Haunted attractions, which in some countries are a genuine seasonal economy. Roller coasters, which are engineering projects, costing tens of millions of pounds, whose entire function is to make you feel like you are falling to your death and then not kill you. Skydiving, free climbing, chili peppers, which are, chemically, a plant defending itself by triggering a pain response, and which we cultivate on an industrial scale specifically to get more of it. There's a name for this from the psychologist Paul Rozin, and it's a good one: benign masochism. The enjoyment of a negative experience in a context where your mind knows with certainty that the danger isn't real. Rosin's suggestion is that a good part of the pleasure comes from precisely that mismatch. The enjoyable business of watching your body be comprehensively wrong while you sit there knowing better. It's the pleasure of overriding an alarm you can't switch off. There's something almost affectionate in it. And notice what the whole thing depends on. One variable, and only one: safety. A roller coaster and a car crash are, from the body's point of view, nearly the same event. Sudden acceleration, loss of control, the strong impression of imminent impact. The physiological response is close to identical. Same adrenaline, same heart rate, same everything. One of them is the best 2 minutes of somebody's summer, and the other is the worst day of their life. The difference isn't in the body at all. It's entirely in the frame. It's the certainty that this is bounded, that it has been engineered, that it ends. Take that certainty away, and the identical stimulus becomes trauma. There's also good reason to think the pleasure isn't really in the fear itself, but on the far side of it, watch people coming off a ride. They're not calm, they're elated, loud, laughing at nothing, gripping each other. The sympathetic system is still fully lit. All that arousal is still circulating, and the threat that justified it has just been definitively cancelled, and the body has all this activation and nowhere to put it. What arrives is a rush of relief that is, chemically speaking, indistinguishable from joy, which suggests a rather elegant definition. Excitement is fear with a guaranteed ending. That's why the same person can adore a horror film and be entirely undone by turbulence on a plane. The bodily response is the same. The difference is that one of them has a run time printed on the ticket. Now, jump scares, because they're worth a moment as pure engineering. A jump scare works on people who know it's coming. It works on people who have seen the film before. You can be sitting there thinking, here it comes, any second now, and it still gets you, and you still hate it, and you still make a noise. That's the low road, and it's the clearest everyday demonstration of everything Ledoux found. Your cortex knows. Your cortex has done the analysis and filed a full report. But the report has to travel, and the fast path doesn't wait for it. And the fast path is not remotely interested in your opinion. It's a 12-millisecond system being deliberately triggered by people who understand it very well. The craft is mostly in the loading. A jump scare isn't the loud noise. It's the silence before it. Good horror filmmakers spend 2 or 3 minutes stretching your attention thin, quieting the sound design until you're leaning forward, and then discharging it all at once. Bad horror just makes a loud noise. The startle reflex fires either way, but only one of them is satisfying. And people differ enormously. And it isn't a matter of courage. Some of it is what's been called sensation seeking, a stable trait, measurable, with a genuine biological basis, describing how much stimulation a person finds pleasant rather than aversive. Some of it is how quickly your arousal returns to baseline afterwards. If your system settles in 5 minutes, the whole experience is a pleasant loop. If it takes you 3 hours, the ride ended long ago and your body is still dealing with it. Same film, same evening. 2 completely different experiences, and neither one is a character flaw. There's a social element too, and it's not incidental. Frightening things are almost always done in groups. Cinemas, ghost trains, fairgrounds. Shared physiological arousal reliably increases feelings of closeness between people. Going through something intense together, even a manufacture something, produces a real bond. It is not an accident that this is a standard shape for a first date. And there's one more thing worth saying about why people seek this out. Because it's easy to be dismissive about it, and I don't think we should be. Frightening entertainment is, among other things, practice. A horror film is a rehearsal in a room where the consequences have been removed. You get to feel the whole shape of the emotion, the dread building, the peak of it, the way it recedes, while your rational mind sits alongside, taking notes, learning something about how you respond and how long it takes you to come back down. You are, in a small way, running a drill. There's a version of this in nearly every mammal that plays. Young animals chase each other, pounce, pin each other down, flee. They rehearse predator and prey over and over in a context where nobody is actually eaten. It's how the equipment gets tested before it's needed. We stopped doing that with our bodies at some point and started doing it with stories instead. It's one plausible reason why frightening stories are a cultural universal, why every society that has ever existed has produced tales about things in the dark, and why we tell them to children, of all people, which on the face of it seems like an odd choice. Perhaps it isn't odd. Perhaps a story is the safest possible place to meet the worst possible thing. And we've known that for a very long time without ever quite saying it out loud. So let's put it as simply as it can be put. The difference between terror and thrill is not the feeling. The feeling is the same feeling. The difference is entirely whether you believe it ends. And everything in this section, every ride, every film, every queue in the rain, rests on that single condition. The carriage pulls back into the station. The credits roll. The lights come up and the body stands down. And the whole thing resolves into a story you tell afterwards. So the obvious question is, what happens when the lights don't come up? And it turns out that for an enormous number of people right now, they don't. Not because anything is chasing them. Because of the world we have built to live in. Before we get to that world, and we will, and it's the part of tonight that's most likely to be about you personally. There's one more piece of machinery we have to put in place. Because so far, this has been a story almost entirely about the alarm going on. And any system with an alarm needs something else, something less dramatic and much less discussed, which is the part that decides when to stop. Fear has an off switch. It's just considerably weaker than the on switch, and that turns out to explain a great deal. The main structure involved sits at the very front of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, and particularly a region on its underside called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which has strong connections down into the amygdala. Its job, broadly, is context. It's the part that knows the glass is there. It knows this is a film. It knows this room, this hour, this situation, and it knows that the sound you just heard is the heating. And it can talk the amygdala down. It does so constantly, all day, in ways you never notice. Because the successful ones don't produce any experience at all. But look at the wiring, because the wiring is not symmetrical. The connections running up from the amygdala to the cortex are stronger and more numerous than the connections running down from the cortex to the amygdala. The alarm has more authority over the office than the office has over the alarm. When they disagree, the alarm usually wins, or at least wins first. That's not a flaw. It's the same arithmetic we've been circling all night, implemented in tissue. A system where careful deliberation could reliably veto the emergency response is a system that dies during the deliberation. So the veto exists, but it's deliberately underpowered and it arrives late, which is why you cannot talk yourself out of a phobia. Not because you lack willpower, because the pathway you'd be using is structurally the weaker of the two, and it's arriving after the decision has been made. Darwin, at the glass, was running exactly this experiment. His cortex had all the correct information. It lost anyway. So if reason can't switch fear off, what can? The answer is a process called extinction, and it's simple to describe. You take a cue that has been paired with something bad, and you present it repeatedly without the bad thing, over and over. And gradually, the response fades. The tone plays and nothing happens. The tone plays and nothing happens. And eventually the animal stops reacting, which looks, obviously, like the fear has been erased, the association has been unlearned, the record has been corrected. That is completely wrong, and there are 3 findings that prove it, and together they're one of the most important results in this entire field. The first is called spontaneous recovery. You extinguish a fear thoroughly. The animal shows no response at all. You wait days, weeks, and test again with no further conditioning of any kind. The fear comes back, not always at full strength, but it's there. It returned on its own from nothing after apparently being gone. The second is renewal, and it's stranger. Extinguish the fear in one room. It's gone, completely, reliably, thoroughly gone in that room. Now move the animal to a different room and present the cue. The fear is back at essentially full strength. Nothing was unlearned. What was learned was this cue is safe here, and here turned out to be part of the lesson. The third is reinstatement. Extinguish the fear. Then, quite separately, give the animal a single unrelated stressful experience. Nothing to do with the original cue. Then test the cue again. It's back. Put those 3 together, and there's only one conclusion available. Extinction does not delete the original memory. The original is still there, intact, underneath. What extinction does is write a second memory, a competing one that says in this place, at this time, under these conditions, this thing is safe, and lay it on top like a coat of paint. Both memories now exist. They compete. Which one wins depends on context, on time, on your stress level, on whether you're somewhere familiar. And under the right conditions, the older one, which is always the stronger one, because it was written by a system that treats threat information as effectively permanent, comes back through. Once you know this, an enormous amount of ordinary human experience clicks into place. It's why phobias relapse. It's why someone can complete a course of treatment, be genuinely fine for 2 years, and then have it return without warning after a bad month. It's why fear of flying comes back after a gap of a few years without flying. Nothing failed. Nothing was ever removed in the first place. A newer, thinner memory was simply outvoted by an older, deeper one. And it's why the fear you had at 19 is still, technically, available to you now. The applied version of all this is exposure therapy, which remains the most effective treatment for phobia and anxiety disorders that anyone has found, and which is essentially extinction performed deliberately on a human being with their cooperation. You approach the feared thing gradually. You stay with it critically. You stay with it long enough for the response to come down on its own while you're still there. Because if you leave at the peak, you've taught yourself that leaving was what saved you, which is the opposite of the lesson. And knowing about renewal changes how it's done. You don't do it all in one room. You vary the context deliberately. Different places, different times of day, different circumstances, because a safety memory that's tied to one clinic on one afternoon will not survive contact with the rest of a life. The variation is not incidental. It's the whole technique which brings us to avoidance, and this is the single most useful thing in this section. So I'll say it slowly. Avoidance is what keeps a fear alive, not the frightening thing, the avoiding. Here's the logic. Every time you avoid something you're afraid of, two things happen. You feel immediate relief, which is a powerful reward and makes you more likely to avoid it again. And this is the part that does the damage. You deny yourself the one experience that could ever contradict the original memory. The competing memory never gets written. The safety lesson never happens. So the original sits there unchallenged for as long as you keep away from it. A fear that is never approached cannot decay. It has nothing to decay against. It simply waits in perfect condition for as long as you like. And this is why the advice people are usually given is so unhelpful. Try not to think about it. Just stay away from it if it upsets you. Don't put yourself through that. Every one of those is kindly meant, and every one of them is mechanically an instruction to preserve the thing indefinitely. It also explains why the fears people carry longest tend to be the convenient ones. If you're frightened of something you can't avoid, a road you have to drive on, a building you have to enter, life forces the exposure on you, and it fades whether you cooperate or not. But if you're frightened of something easy to root around, nothing ever contradicts it, and it can stay at full strength for 50 years while you quietly reorganize your life into a shape that never touches it. That's why fears grow over a lifetime rather than fading, because avoidance is comfortable and it works. And every time it works, it makes the thing slightly larger. So, A strong alarm, a weak break, an off switch that only ever paints over the original and never removes it. That arrangement worked extremely well for a very long time. And it worked for one specific reason, which is easy to miss because it was always true and therefore never had to be stated. It worked because the threats used to end. They arrived, they resolved one way or the other, and then they were over. The animal ran, or it didn't. The storm passed, the stranger left, and afterwards the whole system stood down. The cortisol cleared, the body went back to maintenance, and nothing was carried forward except the memory. Detect, respond, resolve, stand down. Every part of what we've described tonight assumes that fourth step, and in about 30 years, we have built the first environment in the history of life on this planet where it doesn't happen. Look at the threat profile that system was designed for. Acute, it happens now, sharply, and then it's over. Physical, it's a thing, in a place, with a location. And finite, there is a moment at which it is definitively finished. Now look at what worries people today. Money, work, health in a general way rather than a specific one. The future, your children's future. Whether you're doing enough, whether something you said 3 weeks ago landed badly. The state of the world, which arrives in your hand at a rate of several crises a minute, from every continent simultaneously. Every one of those inverts one of the 3 properties. They're chronic rather than acute, abstract rather than physical, and crucially, they don't resolve. That last one is the killer, and here's why. The entire response we described earlier is a preparation for physical action. Adrenaline, blood to the muscles, fuel released, airways open, and the way that response ends naturally is that you use it. You run or you fight, and the arousal is spent, and the body registers that the episode is complete. There is no physical action that discharges a worry about money. There is nothing to run from and nothing to fight. So the arousal is generated and then has nowhere to go, and the body never receives the signal that the episode is over, because it isn't. Which brings us back to that second, slower system I asked you to make a note of much earlier. The one running from the hypothalamus to the pituitary, to the adrenal glands, releasing cortisol. That system was built for a siege, hours at most days. A period of sustained difficulty during which you need glucose available, inflammation suppressed, and everything non-essential put on hold, followed by a return to normal. It was not built to run for 11 years. And when it does, when cortisol stays elevated as a background condition rather than an event, the associations that show up in the research are fairly consistent and fairly unwelcome. Disrupted sleep architecture, particularly a reduction in the deeper restorative stages. Effects on immune function. Effects on how memories are consolidated, which is its own quiet tragedy given what memory does for a person. Cardiovascular strain. Interactions with mood, that run in both directions. I want to state that plainly and then leave it, because there is something faintly absurd about frightening people, about the effects of being frightened, and I have no intention of doing it. The mechanism is the point. Take the mechanism and leave the rest. Now, the supply side. And I want to describe this mechanically rather than making it a complaint, because as a complaint, it's boring, and as a mechanism, it's genuinely interesting. Start with a fact we established earlier tonight. Threat-relevant information captures attention preferentially. It always has. That's not a modern development. It's the low road doing exactly what it was built for. A frightening thing will pull your eyes away from a pleasant thing, reliably in every human being, without any effort or intention. Now put that fact into a system that selects content according to what holds attention. You don't need anyone to have intended anything. You don't need a decision, or a plan, or a villain. You just need a selection pressure and enough iterations. Anything optimized for attention will drift over time toward material that engages the attention systems most reliably. And the most reliable attention system in the human head is the one built for detecting danger. So the drift is toward alarm. Not because alarm is good or true or useful, but because it's sticky, and stickiness is the only thing being measured. And the result is a supply of threat signal that is, for practical purposes, unlimited. It doesn't run out. It's personalized, so it finds the particular things that work on you specifically. And it is available at 3 in the morning, in bed, in the dark, at arm's length. Now connect that to what we said about contagion, because this is the same mechanism wearing modern clothes. Those monkeys learned a lifelong terror from a videotape, from watching another monkey be afraid on a screen of something that was not in the room. That's the whole finding, and we found it fascinating an hour ago. We do it all day, continuously, at a scale and a rate that has no precedent whatsoever. Fear transmission decoupled from proximity, running without pause, delivered by people who are themselves reacting to things they have not seen. And the low road does not distinguish. It cannot. A threatening image on a screen goes through the same 12-millisecond pathway that evolved for detecting movement in long grass. And that pathway has no category for this is happening 4,000 miles away. No category for this is a photograph, and no category for this does not concern you. Those are all cortical judgments. They arrive later, and by then the response has fired. I should be honest about the evidence here, because it's easy to overclaim. Reported anxiety has risen substantially, particularly among younger people, over the past couple of decades. Whether that's a genuine increase, or better recognition, or reduced stigma, making people more willing to say it, or all three at once, is genuinely hard to separate and remains actively argued over. I don't want to hand you a statistic and pretend it settles something it doesn't. But the mechanism doesn't depend on the statistic. The mechanism is just this: a detection system calibrated for a world of finite, physical, resolving threats, now living in a world of infinite, abstract, unresolving ones, with a supply of alarm signal that is effectively bottomless and no physical action available that could ever discharge it. So here, finally, is the metaphor at full weight. The smoke detector is not broken. It has never been broken. It is doing exactly, precisely what it was built to do, with the same sensitivity it has always had. And that sensitivity was correct. We have simply moved it into a building where something somewhere is always faintly smoldering. Not enough to burn. Never enough to burn. Just enough that the sensor always has something to report. And then we stand underneath it and wonder why it won't stop. And I'd like to point out, since you're lying there, that right now, in this room, at this hour, nothing at all is happening. There is no threat here. The building is quiet. The doors are what they were. Your detector has been running its checks continuously since you lay down, at whatever rate it runs them, and it has found nothing worth telling you about. That's why you've been able to lie there and listen to a fairly long account of terror and stay perfectly comfortable throughout. The system is working. It just has nothing to say. That's what a good night is. But it does raise a question. And it's one that sounded like science fiction about 20 years ago and stopped being science fiction shortly afterwards. If a fear memory can't be deleted by experience, if extinction only ever paints over it, could it be reached some other way? Could it be reached chemically? The answer, uncomfortably, is that we already partly can. The finding that opened this up is called reconsolidation, and it overturned an assumption that had been sitting quietly under memory research for a century. The assumption was that memories consolidate. You have an experience, and over the following hours it's gradually written into a durable form. And after that it's fixed, stable, a record. You can retrieve it, and retrieving it plays it back, and playing it back doesn't change it any more than reading a page changes the page. That turns out not to be how it works at all. When you retrieve a memory, it doesn't play back. It becomes unstable. It re-enters a labile state and has to be actively rewritten using fresh protein synthesis in order to persist at all. For a window of a few hours after recall, that memory is chemically vulnerable in a way it isn't at any other time. The demonstration was elegant. Take a rat with a well-established fear memory. Remind it, briefly present the cue, opening the window. Then, during that window, block protein synthesis in the amygdala. The memory doesn't come back. Not weakened. Substantially gone. And the crucial control is that if you don't remind the animal first, the same drug does nothing at all, because the memory was never opened, which gives you the sentence that makes this whole area strange, and slightly unsettling. The only moment a memory can be changed is the moment you remember it. The lock only opens from the inside, and only briefly, and only when you go looking. The obvious next question was whether you could do something like this in a person without blocking protein synthesis in their brain, which is not a thing one does to people. Enter propranolol. It's an ordinary beta blocker, a common, decades-old drug that interferes with adrenaline signaling, prescribed for blood pressure and heart conditions, and famously taken by musicians before auditions to stop their hands shaking. The logic is this: adrenaline plays a role in how strongly emotional memories are laid down. So, bring the fear memory up deliberately to open the reconsolidation window. Give propranolol and let the memory reform in a chemically quieter environment, and the reported results are genuinely interesting. In several studies, the emotional charge is reduced while the factual content is retained. People still remember what happened. They can tell you the whole story in order, accurately. It just stops arriving with the body attached. The memory comes back without the heart rate and the dread coming back with it. Now, I want to be scrupulous here, because this is exactly the sort of finding that gets oversold, and I'd rather keep your trust than give you a better story. The results have been mixed. Effect sizes vary considerably between studies. Replication has been inconsistent, which in this field usually means the effect is real but conditional on things we haven't fully identified: timing, dose, how the memory is reactivated, how old it is. It is not an available treatment. Nobody is being cured of anything with a beta blocker. If you take one thing from this section, let it be the reconsolidation window rather than the drug, because the window can be exploited without drugs at all, and that's where the most promising work has gone. If you reactivate a fear memory to open the window and then run extinction training inside that window rather than outside it, some studies find the effect is markedly more durable, resisting the spontaneous recovery and the renewal we talked about earlier. Same technique, better timing. Whether it holds up robustly is still being worked out. The most immediately practical thing in this area, though, isn't chemical at all. It's virtual reality. Think about what exposure therapy needs: repetition, control over intensity, and, because of renewal, deliberate variation of context. Now think about how badly the real world supplies those. If someone is terrified of flying, you cannot run 20 flights on a graded schedule. If someone is terrified of driving, you cannot arrange 100 controlled encounters at increasing difficulty. In virtual reality, you can. Infinitely repeatable, precisely graded, and you can change the context arbitrarily. Different weather, different time of day, different city, which is exactly the variation that defeats the renewal effect. It's not glamorous, but it may be the single most useful application of everything in this section. And it's in clinics now. And then there's MDMA. There has been a substantial and serious research program into MDMA-assisted therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder. Proper randomized trials published in major journals with results that were striking enough to generate a great deal of attention. The proposed mechanism connects directly to everything we've discussed. Severe traumatic memories are frequently unapproachable. Attempting to engage with them produces such an overwhelming response that the therapeutic work can't happen at all. The suggestion is that the drug reduces amygdala reactivity enough for a person to hold the memory in mind and work with it without being flooded, turning the volume down just far enough that the door can be opened. The regulatory picture has been complicated and contested, with regulators requesting further evidence rather than approving on the basis of what's been submitted so far. I'd say honestly that this may have moved since I last had reliable information about it. And it's the sort of thing worth checking rather than taking from me. But set the science aside for a moment, because underneath all of this is a question that no experiment is going to settle. Fear memories are, for the most part, correct. That's the thing. They're not errors. They're not distortions. They are accurate records of things that genuinely happened to a person. A trauma memory is true, and editing it, dampening it, softening it, reaching in and turning it down means editing an accurate account of someone's own life. So where exactly is the line between relieving suffering and removing a person's history? And if a fear could be reduced, should it always be? A great deal is attached to that wire. Grief carries fear in it. So does love, in its way. Most of what we're frightened of losing is what we care about, and it's not obvious. Those can be separated cleanly. What else comes away when you cut it? And who decides? For a soldier, for someone who survived an assault, for a child who cannot consent and whose whole personality is still being assembled around whatever happened. I'm not going to resolve any of that, because the field hasn't. What I'd say is that the technology is arriving considerably faster than the agreement about it, which is not a new pattern and never ends particularly tidily. And all of this, the drugs, the windows, the therapies, exists because of the people for whom none of it is theoretical. So let's talk about them. And then, finally, let's go back and finish the story we left unfinished a long time ago, tonight. Post-traumatic stress disorder is what this system looks like when it doesn't stand down. And by now you have all the vocabulary for it, which I hope is quite satisfying, because we assembled every piece of this over the last hour and a half. The intrusive memories, the original trace, written under enormous adrenaline and therefore written extremely strongly, retrieved without being asked for, arriving with the full physiological response attached, because that's what it was encoded with. The hypervigilance. The detector's threshold permanently lowered. In a genuinely dangerous environment, lowering that threshold is correct. It's the right adjustment. It just doesn't come back up when the environment changes. The startle response that never resets. The sleep that won't consolidate. Because consolidation is one of the things chronic cortisol interferes with, and the avoidance, which, as we established, is the mechanism that keeps the whole thing alive. Every act of avoidance is immediately rewarded with relief, and every act of avoidance prevents the competing memory from ever being written. The condition maintains itself perfectly through a process that feels at every moment like coping. There's an important complication, and I want to state it because leaving it out would be dishonest. Most people exposed to severe trauma do not develop PTSD. The majority recover. Resilience is the normal outcome, not the exception. And why some people are resilient and others aren't is one of the genuinely open questions. Prior history matters. Social support matters, apparently a great deal. Genetics probably matters, but we cannot predict it. And anyone who tells you otherwise is ahead of the evidence. It's also worth saying that the condition is not a measure of what someone went through. Two people can come out of the same event on the same day, standing next to each other, and one of them will be carrying it in 5 years and the other won't. That difference is not courage and it is not character. It's a system with a threshold in it, and thresholds vary in the way that every biological parameter varies. Height, blood pressure, how well you see in the dark, which is worth remembering the next time anyone is described as having handled something well. What that usually means is that their detector happened to settle. It's a good outcome. It just isn't an achievement. And treating it as one leaves the people whose detectors didn't settle carrying something extra that they should never have been handed. Now, let's go back. Earlier tonight I told you about a woman the literature calls SM, the woman with Urbach-Wied disease, whose amygdala had been destroyed on both sides, the woman who handled snakes in a pet shop and had to be told 15 times to stop, who led a group through a haunted house and poked one of the actors out of curiosity, who had been held at knife point and walked back through the same park the next day. I said we'd come back to her, and I said the question was whether she had lost the feeling of fear or only the machinery that produces the behavior. In 2013, researchers tried one more thing. They gave her a mask and had her inhale air containing a high concentration of carbon dioxide. Around 35%, a single breath. This is physically harmless. It's a standard procedure. Your oxygen supply is fine and nothing is damaged. But it produces a very specific sensation. And the sensation is suffocation. Because your body doesn't monitor oxygen, to decide whether you're breathing adequately. It monitors carbon dioxide. Rising CO2 is the signal that says you are not getting rid of what you need to get rid of. And it is the single most reliable way to trigger the sensation of not being able to breathe. The critical thing, the thing this whole experiment turns on, is where that signal comes from. It doesn't come from the world. There is nothing to see, nothing approaching, nothing in the room, no sound, no shape on the path. The threat signal originates inside the body, and it is detected by chemoreceptors in the brainstem. And it never goes anywhere near the amygdala she doesn't have. She had a panic attack, a full one, immediate, overwhelming terror. She reported the fear starting before she could even describe what was happening. She struggled, tried to pull the mask away, and was in obvious and severe distress. And afterwards, she said something extraordinary. She said she had never felt anything like it before in her life. She was in her 40s. She had been threatened with a knife and with a gun. She had been assaulted. She had spent years being deliberately shown the most frightening material researchers could obtain. And the first time she experienced fear was in a laboratory, from a lungful of harmless air, nor was it just her. The same experiment was run with 2 other patients with bilateral amygdala damage, twin sisters, with the same condition. They panicked too. So sit with what that means, because it reorganizes everything. The amygdala is not required for the experience of fear. It cannot be, because here are 3 people without one having the most intense fear of their lives. What the amygdala is required for is detecting threat in the outside world. That's the door those things come through. The snake, the weapon, the shape on the path, the sound in the hall. In SM, that door had been bricked up, which is why the entire external world had lost its capacity to frighten her. But there is a second system, and it faces the other way. It's built around interoception, the body's monitoring of its own internal state. Brainstem chemoreceptors. The insula, which is where the body's internal condition gets represented. It watches your CO2 levels, your heart, your breathing, your gut, your blood chemistry. And when something is wrong in there, it can generate terror entirely on its own, without any assistance from the amygdala at all. 2 systems. One facing out, one facing in, one word covering both, and a century of research that couldn't fully tell them apart. And notice, this vindicates Ledoux retroactively and rather beautifully. He argued that the defensive circuit and the conscious feeling were separable. SM is the demonstration. Her defensive circuit for external threat was destroyed, and her capacity for the felt experience of terror was completely intact. It just needed a different door, and it explains something else, which is the piece that never fitted. Panic disorder has always been slightly awkward inside the standard model of fear. Because panic attacks arrive without a trigger. That's the defining feature. People sitting quietly on a bus, in no danger of any kind, are suddenly overwhelmed by terror and the absolute conviction that they're dying. And the standard response is to look for the trigger, and there frequently isn't one. And then everyone concludes it's irrational. But now look at it the other way round. The trigger was never external, so of course nobody could find it. The trigger came from inside, a shift in blood chemistry, a change in breathing pattern, an irregular heartbeat, a small interoceptive signal that the inward-facing system read as a suffocation cue and responded to exactly as designed. There's a long-standing hypothesis along precisely these lines, that panic is a false suffocation alarm, an internal monitor firing on ambiguous data. And the fact that inhaling CO2 reliably induces panic attacks, and does so far more readily in people with panic disorder, is fairly hard to argue with. Which means the sequence in a panic attack runs backwards from what everyone assumes. The fear arrives first. Then the mind, which cannot tolerate an effect without a cause, searches the environment for a reason and finds whatever is nearby. The bus, the crowd, the shop. And that thing gets blamed, and then avoided, and then, through the exact mechanism we described, it becomes genuinely frightening, permanently, because it was never approached again. The explanation was always written afterwards. It was never the cause. Which brings us back, finally, to where we started this evening. Something moved in you before you did. In a dark house, at some point in your life, and you never had the chance to be consulted about it. We can say now what that was. Or rather, we can say that there are two of them. One watching the world, one watching you. Both older than your species, both running continuously, and neither one requiring your permission or your attention or your gratitude. So, where does that leave us? Honestly, in a good place. Better than most people assume, we know the circuit. We can trace a signal from an ear to a muscle and tell you the route it took and how long it took. We know where the alarm lives and what happens when it's gone. We know the learning rules, that one pairing is enough, that the association spreads, that some lessons are privileged and others are almost impossible to install. We know the off switch is weak and that it paints over rather than erases, and knowing that has made treatment genuinely better rather than merely more confident. And we know there are two systems, not one, which nobody knew 25 years ago. And there's a thing we still cannot do, and it's worth naming clearly rather than hiding at the end. We can describe the entire mechanism of terror without explaining why terror feels like anything. We can map every step. Ear, thalamus, amygdala, hypothalamus, adrenal gland, heart. 12 milliseconds here, 100 there. We can predict the behavior, produce it, suppress it, and reach into the memory of it. And nowhere in that entire chain Is there anything that accounts for why any of it should be accompanied by the awful, unmistakable, first-person experience of being afraid, rather than simply happening efficiently and in the dark, the way the rest of your body's business does? We can map the wire. We can't map the fire. And that isn't an embarrassment or a gap that better equipment will close next year. It's the same problem that sits underneath every question about conscious experience. And it is the genuine frontier. It's where the interesting work is. Anyone who tells you it's nearly solved is selling something. But I want to end somewhere else, because there's a way of looking at all of this that I find quietly moving, and I'd like to leave it with you. Go back to the smoke detector one last time. A detector going off at 3 in the morning because of burnt toast is, on its face, an object failing at its job. It's annoying. You stand on a chair in the dark and you hate it, but consider what it actually is. It is a thing that was put on your ceiling by someone who did not want you to die in your sleep. That's the whole of it. Every false alarm it has ever produced was that same intention, arriving badly. The irritation and the care are not two different features of the object. They're the same feature seen from underneath. Everything we have talked about tonight is a description of that object. Your fear is not a defect in you. It is the accumulated, ruthless, 400 million year effort of an unbroken line of ancestors, none of whom you will ever meet, all of whom are still working to keep something like you alive. It's frequently wrong. It's calibrated for a world that no longer exists. It goes off at hoses, on paths and shapes in the corner of a room, and at absolutely nothing at all. And it has never once, in your entire life, stopped watching, not for a single hour, not while you were distracted, or busy, or unhappy, or asleep. It has been on duty since before you had a name for anything. And it will still be on duty tonight, long after you've stopped paying attention to it. For those whose alarm rings constantly, and it may be that you're one of them, I'm not going to tell you it's beautiful. It isn't from the inside, and I wouldn't insult you by pretending. What I'd say instead is that it is a mechanism, and mechanisms are understood. And this one is understood better every single year. The treatments work, not perfectly, not for everyone, but they work, and they are getting better. A system that is stuck is not a person who is broken. Those are genuinely different things, and the difference matters. But for tonight, none of that needs doing, because here's what's true right now in this room. Nothing is coming. The house is quiet. The doors are as they were. Every check that the system knows how to run has been run several thousand times since you lay down, and every single one has come back clear. And in a few minutes, if it hasn't started already, your brainstem is going to do the thing it does every night. It will begin, carefully and in the correct order, to let go of your muscles, The same paralysis we talked about earlier, arriving exactly on schedule, safely, the way it has every night of your life. And you'll go somewhere the alarm cannot follow you, and it will keep watch anyway. It always does. It doesn't know how to do anything else. So let it. Let the questions rest. They'll all still be here in the morning, patient and entirely unresolved and perfectly happy to wait. Nothing needs deciding tonight, just the room. Just the dark, which is only the dark. Just the weight of you settling. Just the quiet, just this.